Well, good evening. Very nice to see all of you here this evening. We have a couple of Bible questions, which I will get to right here at the beginning of the study. And I also have an announcement. Inventory. We were just notified that Maison Blanche is in need of people to help in the pre-inventory beginning Tuesday, January 2nd through Friday the 6th from 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. each day. This is your chance to make extra money. If you are interested, please let Mrs. Alvarado know which days and hours you want to work before you leave tonight. Also, the fundraiser will be held Sunday, January 8th from 4 p.m. till midnight. If you are one that signed up already, please let Mrs. Alvarado know if you're still able to take part. So this will make you aware of that for the inventory, as well as the opportunity for the pre-inventory, those who would like to perhaps take advantage of the opportunity to earn a little extra cash. The question is asked, as the Israelites crossed over into the Promised Land, how were they able to communicate with the inhabitants of the land? Weren't their languages different? That's a good question. Yes, the basic languages were different, though there was probably certain things that they had in common. There were certain languages that were, let's say, commonly used second languages, just as we would have today. You know, in most areas of the world, languages such as English or French or Spanish are second languages in many areas of the world that provide a basis. The Israelites, of course, would have spoken Hebrew as their own native tongue, as well as, of course, most of them understanding at least some Egyptian, some of them being fluent in the Egyptian language. There, in the land of Canaan, there was significant Egyptian influence. There was contact back and forth. So certainly at least a limited use of the Egyptian language by some of the people would have been there. Aramaic, which is akin to Hebrew, was kind of a language of trade and commerce throughout a large part of the Middle Eastern area. I don't know that there's any indication that there was a lot of communication back and forth. For the most part, there was obviously some. You have the account of Rahab the harlot, and you know, she was able to make herself understood to the spies, and they were to her. What language they communicated in, we're not told. Very likely it was some form of Egyptian that, you know, in some of these areas, particularly where there was trade and commerce, you tend to have a language that is a language of commerce, and even if people are not real fluent in it, they can get by. This area was an area that was on the route of the what's called the Fertile Crescent and the caravan routes. So there were, while not every individual would have had any knowledge of other languages, certainly people who were in contact with the public and with the caravans and the trading public would have tended to have at least a limited knowledge of something else, probably Egyptian dialect, maybe Aramaic as well. Where does Job come into history, and where does his life take place? What country? Well, we're told in the book of Job that Let's notice here in the beginning of the book of Job, there was a man in the land of Uz. Now, we're not given a lot of details about where this land of Uz is. The land of Uz, there is reference. Let's notice back in the book of Genesis. In Genesis 10:23, it mentions the sons of Aram, who would be the grandsons of Shem, and they were Uz, Hul, Gether, and Mash. Aram was the father of the Arameans, or the Aramaic people. They were kindred to the Hebrews. Armenia takes its name from Aram. They primarily through the son Hul. The area of Uz anciently was in the area from, kind of bordering Egypt, not really in Egypt. It was up kind of between Egypt and Syria was the general area of Uz anciently. You might look on a Bible map and get the area of the, if they show the Arameans. It would have been the area to the east of what became the land of Israel, and it would be north of Egypt and south of Damascus, if you were to look on there. Let's notice a couple of other references to Uz in Genesis 22. Here is another reference to a similar word where it refers to the children of Abraham's brother. Milcah has borne, Genesis 22:20, Milcah has borne children to your brother Nahor, Huz, his firstborn, and Buz, his brother, and Kemuel, the father of Aram. It goes on and names several of the ones that are mentioned there. Now, you might hold your place, and it mentions, let's see, all right, the friends of Job that are mentioned in Job 2:11, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite, mentions them coming together there. And one of the things that if you notice from there, then back in Genesis, in Job 32, verse 2. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel the Buzite, of the kindred of Ram. Now, if you held the place there in Genesis 22, we noticed the sons of Abraham's brother Nahor were Huz, Buz, Kemuel, the father of Aram, or Ram. Now this Elihu that's mentioned in the book of Job was a Buzite, in other words, a descendant of Buz, at least a grandson, maybe a great-grandson of Buz. of the kindred of Ram, which of course equates here with what is mentioned in Genesis 22:21. The Temanites, Teman was a son of Esau. Now, what we're seeing here, the Bible does not clearly define, it does not give Job's lineage. We have speculated on certain things in times past. The thing that becomes apparent from the book of Job, from the friends that are mentioned, and the information that is given, is the time setting was an area that was on the border of Egypt, or the location was on an area that was the border of Egypt. The people that were involved were people of the general stock of Abraham and Abraham's family. We see that Elihu, the Buzite, would have been a descendant of Abraham's brother Nahor. The Temanites would have Eliphaz the Temanite. Elihu the Buzite was, you see, would have come down through Nahor and Buz and down in that line, which would have made them kindred to the descendants of Abraham. The Temanites, if you go to them, they were descendants of Esau. So what you have is something several generations after Abraham. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob's generation was the generation of, let's say, the grandchildren of Abraham. This Job's friend, the Eliphaz the Temanite, would have been at least would have been, let's say, of the generation of the patriarchs of the 12 sons of Jacob. So what you're looking at, the general time setting, would probably be around the time that Israel would have been prior to the Exodus, but it would have been, let's say, after the time of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Would have probably been contemporary with the time that Jacob and his family were in Egypt. The events described in the book of Job involved some of the peoples of the general family of Abraham that were nearby, but not in the direct lineage. They're the ones that are specifically mentioned by name. The indication is kind of general relatives, kindred peoples, and yet not necessarily the exact lineage. The book of Job, we're told, traces back to Moses. In other words, Moses was responsible for its inclusion with the books. So it was something that took place prior to Moses. I think that's clear. There's no reference when God's great power is described in the book of Job. There's no mention, no allusion to the events of the Exodus, to the events of the flood, to the events of creation, but not to the Exodus. So it's something that predates the Exodus that would come probably contemporary with the story of Joseph and his brothers, right in that general time setting, that generation. Okay. We will go into the book of Job in detail in a later Bible study, a later series of Bible studies. But this evening, we've been going through, of course, the Old Testament from the standpoint of an historical survey. In other words, not going through every book of the Old Testament, but going through the story flow of the history of the Old Testament. Starting with the book of Genesis, coming on down through the 5 books of Moses, through Joshua and Judges, through the story of Samuel, Kings, Chronicles as has been put together, then through the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, which picks up the story from the time of the captivity, the Babylonian captivity, until the conclusion of what we have, the story we have directly recorded in our Bibles. Now, after the death of Ezra and Nehemiah, the completed Old Testament, as the Jews have preserved it, was delivered into the hands of the great synagogue, which was presided over by the high priest, the great synagogue or the great assembly. We're told in the book of Nehemiah that Nehemiah brought together a great assembly. And he presided over it. After his death, it was presided over by the high priest. And this was the group that was charged with responsibility for maintaining the reforms that Ezra and Nehemiah had brought together or had accomplished. And so there is reference here in the book of Nehemiah to these things and to the specifics. That's where some of the genealogies and some of these lists of names which we went into or which we did not focus on in detail are given because they delineate who was involved in the Great Assembly. Let's see. Okay. When there were events that took place. Ezra, you remember, brought back the copy of the law. He brought back the scriptures from Babylon, and as he brought back those scriptures from Babylon, he was responsible for teaching them there to the Jews who had returned. And this set the stage. You know, they had all the problems. All right, this set the stage. The Great Assembly was left with responsibility for maintaining the reforms. Now, there were other events going on in the world that affected what was happening with the Jews and what was happening in Judea. The events were, of course, that the Persian Empire, under which the Jews had gained this independence, continued on along for a period of time, basically for a generation after the death of Ezra and Nehemiah, by about 400 B.C., which the book of Malachi was the last book that was written, that was added in there to the time of it. The book of Malachi would be contemporary with Ezra and Nehemiah. And by 400 B.C., the canon of the Old Testament was completed. By this time, Ezra and Nehemiah were both dead or within a very short time after then. All right, the Persian Empire continued on along over the course of the next 70 years. Now, of course, over the course of the next 70 years, we have, by the time 70 years has passed, a generation who's come into leadership that only know of Ezra and Nehemiah by what they have heard from others. They were as far removed from Ezra and Nehemiah as we are removed from World War I. The events of World War I certainly affected us. There are a handful of people left who have first-hand memory There are others who have second-hand memory, who heard stories and have been told of it by their parents and by people who went through it. But you see, after 70 years, even those are less and less. So the generation that was on the scene in leadership positions when Alexander the Great overthrew the Persian Empire were as far removed from Ezra and Nehemiah as we are removed from World War I. Now, Alexander the Great had a tremendous impact on the ancient world at that time and a major impact on the events that shaped the world into which Jesus Christ came. Because what we're wanting to set this evening is we're wanting to set the stage for the story that we're going to encounter next Bible study when we go into the New Testament and a survey of the Gospels and Acts. And what we find is the events that shaped the society into which the Messiah came. Now, one of the events that greatly shaped this was Alexander the Great. Now, the events of between the Testament are told in the Bible. They aren't directly told in the Bible, but they're told in prophecy. They're told in the book of Daniel. We might just notice very, very briefly in the book of Daniel, in chapter 8. Daniel saw in vision. You see, Daniel is writing prior to the time and around the time that Babylon fell in 539, before the Persian Empire came to power, and right around the time that it did. Daniel saw a vision in Daniel chapter 8. In verse 3, he saw a ram that had two horns. The horns were high, one was higher than the other. And this ram pushed west and north and south, and nothing was able to stand before it. And then a he-goat, verse 5, came from the west on the face of the whole earth, touched not the ground. The goat had a notable horn between his eyes, one great horn. This was a rather unusual looking goat. You know, any of you raised goats, you haven't, chances are, raised one like this, that only had one horn and it protruded out from between his eyes. And he came to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing before the river, and he ran into it in the fury of his power. He was moved with a collar against him. He smote the ram, he broke the two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. And he cast him to the ground and stamped on him. So this was the end of the story. The goat waxed very great when he was strong. And the great horn was broken, and in its place came up four horns toward the four winds of heaven. Now, this was an unusual thing. You break a goat's horn off and you don't see four little sprouts come out. But this is what happened with this particular goat. Well, it goes on into some other things, but let's notice the interpretation, verse 20 of Daniel 8. The ram which you saw having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. The rough goat is the king of Greece. The great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, four kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. So what we find here is that Alexander is the story, you see, that the empire of the Medes and Persians was going to come in, was going to conquer, and then they would be overthrown by an empire from the west, an empire that was going to move with great force and speed, the empire of Greece, the kingdom of Greece, that was typified in that great horn by its one significant king, the one who was the founder of the empire, Alexander the Great. And that he was going to sweep across and absolutely destroy this ram, the Medes and the empire of the Medes and the Persians. But then this great horn, this king, Alexander the Great, was going to be broken off. And rather than his empire being perpetuated by his sons and grandsons and on like that, it would be broken off and it would split into four divisions, each ruled over by a king one of his generals, as it actually was, and that was the case. Now, let's go on a little bit further. In Daniel 11, in verse 2, Daniel was told, "There shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia." This refers to Xerxes. That there would Xerxes would be the one to stir up everyone against Greece. "And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity. And nor according to the dominion which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up." And then it talks about a king of the south in verse 5 that is described, and it talks about in verse 13 a king of the north. Now what we have, and as you go on through Daniel 11, we have a story that breaks down to a fight between a king of the north and a king of the south. Now, let's get the picture. Alexander's empire conquered the known world. It spread across from Greece. He crossed into what is now modern-day Turkey, the area of Asia Minor, swept across there, came down through Palestine, conquered the area there of Judea, came all the way down into Egypt, conquered Egypt, spread across to the Euphrates River, to ancient Babylon, across the Euphrates, into Persia, all the way into India. He got all the way to Afghanistan, the area there of India and Afghanistan. In fact, certain of the Afghan tribes traced themselves back to the generals. They are descended from some of the soldiers of Alexander the Great. A bunch of fighters. They've been fighting ever since. Nobody has ever been able to do anything with them, as the Russians have learned out to their dismay. You read the story of the British Empire at its height, and the most that the British were ever able to do with the Afghans was to put soldiers at the Khyber Pass and to keep them from coming into India. They tried to go in. They had a very similar escapade in Afghanistan to what the Russians did, and they finally decided the simplest thing to do was to get out of Afghanistan, just guard the pass and not let them get out. Keep them there. But they are a rough bunch when it comes to that. But many of the soldiers, Alexander the Great's empire spread all the way across to there. All the way across to India. He conquered the northern part of India, the part that he wanted, and up to the border there of what is now Afghanistan, left soldiers, and so spread across the whole Middle East. He united the whole Middle East, everything from Greece to India. You see, the Persian Empire had not gone that far west. The Persian Empire had extended up to portions of India. Alexander the Great conquered even more of India than the Persians had. The Persians had had a great empire. Alexander the Great smashed their empire. And you know what? He did it in just a few years. Basically 10 years, Alexander conquered the world. From 333 BC, when he crossed the Dardanelles from Greece into Turkey, in 10 years, he was dead. He was 30 years old. He was dead. And you have to, he was obviously a remarkable individual to have been able to stir things up to that point. Well, when he died, there was no one person to take his empire. It very quickly, within a few years, it split into 4 divisions, led by his 4 generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Cassander, and Lysimachus. These were the 4 particular generals that split it. That is prophesied, you see, in the book of Daniel, that this would happen. Daniel was writing before the fact. Well, within a matter of time, within a matter of a few decades after then, the empire consolidated to where Seleucus in the north, who ruled the area of what is modern-day Syria across to Babylon, and Ptolemy, spelled Ptolemy, looks like Ptolemy, but it's normally pronounced Ptolemy. He ruled Egypt in the south. And this is north and south from the standpoint of Jerusalem, which is normally the way directions are given in the Bible from the standpoint of Jerusalem. You know, what's east and west is different if you're in China as opposed to if you're in the United States or if you're in Europe. You know, directions are a matter of of east and west. It's a matter of where you are, where in relationship to other things. Well, the directions given in the Bible are normally from the standpoint of Jerusalem. The portions of Alexander's empire that had long-term impact on the Jews was the area of Seleucus to the north and Ptolemy to the south. These are outlined in Daniel 11. You see the king of the north and the king of the south pushing at each other back and forth. And it records in detail. We're not going to go through the details of Daniel 11. We will at a later time. But it actually records in advance all of the struggles back and forth. Now, if you look at a map and you look at the area to the north where Syria stretches across to Babylon, and you look at the south where Egypt is, what's in the middle? What's between them? Jerusalem. The area of the Jews. Now, what do you think they fought over? Because it didn't take them long to start fighting. They wanted to expand their territory. Well, what is in the middle? Jerusalem. The area of the Jews. So when they were going to fight, what were they going to fight over? Who was going to rule that? You see, it was a matter that if Ptolemy was going to move north and try to fight against the Seleucids, the kingdoms of the north, then he had to go through Jerusalem to get there. And if the Seleucids were going to come to the south and going to fight against Egypt and try to conquer that, they had to come through Jerusalem to get there. So what it amounted to was the Jews caught it in every direction. Every time they came through, the Jews got caught in the middle. And this set the stage for events that were going on, and that greatly affected them, that shaped the world into which Jesus Christ came. Now, the event of Alexander the Great's, his coming on the scene, there is a major event that resulted, a major thing that resulted from Alexander's conquest. And that was the Greek language and culture was diffused throughout the known world, from all the way across to India. So Greek language and culture, now there was, you see, each of these four kingdoms that came up was still a Greek kingdom. The Ptolemies who ruled Egypt, the last of the Ptolemies was Cleopatra. She's probably the best known. She was the last of the Ptolemies. You heard the story of Antony and Cleopatra. She committed suicide and the Romans swallowed up her kingdom. But she was the last of the Ptolemies. She was not Egyptian in the ethnic sense. She was Greek. The Ptolemies were Greek. See, they were descended from one of Alexander's generals who conquered that area and who ruled it. The Seleucids, who ruled across from Syria to Babylon, whose capital was at Antioch, Antioch in Syria. Well, they named it after themselves. The Antiochus was one of the most popular names that all these kings up in the north had, you see. We'll talk about one in a few minutes whose name was Antiochus Epiphanes, which means Antiochus of the glorious appearing. He obviously had a rather high opinion of himself. Must have thought he looked pretty good. And he plays a role in both Bible history and Bible prophecy. So, the stage was set. The Greek language and culture spread across the known world. Now, this set the stage for the New Testament because what is the New Testament written in? It's written in Greek. There was a common language that most educated people could speak by the time of the New Testament. That's why the apostles could go into different areas of the world and they could communicate in the Greek language. The apostle Paul could travel, and wherever he traveled, he could generally communicate in Greek. Not to say that he didn't speak other languages. But the New Testament could be written in Greek, and the Christian community at that time could understand it scattered throughout a wide area, because the Greek language was the language of education. People spoke their native language, but in addition, if they were educated, if they went to school, they learned Greek. It became the language of education, the language of trade and commerce. In much the same way that the spread of the British Empire in the 19th century set the stage for God's work today. Because the diffusion of the English language throughout the world meant that God's work could go to the world in English and reach educated people throughout the world, and whose native tongues would have been languages that we would have had no way to have gained access to. And then, of course, as people, educated people in those societies came into the church, speaking, having a knowledge of English, that's the way they learned the truth, but also speaking the native language of their country, then it opened the way for the work to go out in other languages. But if it had not been, you see, for the widespread use of English as well as other colonial languages, that set the stage. You see, we could go first in English to a great deal of the world, and what we couldn't reach in English could generally be reached in French throughout the other portions of the non-English parts of the Caribbean and the non-English parts of Africa could be reached in that way by the French language. And then the Spanish language, again, as a result of colonial empires throughout the areas of Latin America. So in three languages, the vast majority of nations could be impacted. God set the stage for that. He determines the bounds of their, we're told God is made of one blood, all people that on the face of the earth do dwell, and has determined the bounds of their habitation and the times before appointed. So God has a great time plan. Now the Greeks came on the scene and they spread across the world. They spread a knowledge of Greek language and Greek culture. And then within a very short time, it came down to a Greek kingdom in the north and a Greek kingdom in the south. And the Jews were caught in the middle. Now, Alexander the Great played a role. I want to read you a few comments from the Jewish historian Josephus. He was one who wrote, he was contemporary with the Apostle Paul. He was a priest of the priestly family there in Jerusalem. He was a general that in the war of the Jews against the Romans was taken captive by the Romans and therefore lived to write an account. He gives a very good historical account of many of these things. There are a number of comments that he makes, and we can pick up the story here earlier at the time of Alexander. Let me read you a comment on the Alexander the Great. It says Alexander, when he had taken Gaza, that is in Egypt, made haste to go up to Jerusalem, And Jaddua, the high priest, when he heard that, was in an agony and under terror, not knowing how he should meet the Macedonians, since the king was displeased with him. So Alexander, this is about 331 BC, this is about 70 years after the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, is on his way to Jerusalem. He's conquered Egypt, and now he's coming to Jerusalem, and the high priest is scared because he knows Alexander is mad. And he determines what should he do. And so then what they decided to do, they decided the best course was to bring out a copy of the book of Daniel and to show Alexander what was said about him. They figured, they needed to do something to get on his good side. So we're told, when the book of Daniel was showed him, wherein Daniel declared that one of the Greeks should destroy the empire of the Persians, he supposed that himself was the person intended. And as he was then glad, he dismissed the multitude. But the next day he called them and bade them ask what favors they pleased of him, whereupon the high priest desired that they might enjoy the laws of their forefathers and pay no tribute on the 7th year. He granted all that they desired. And when they entreated of him that he would permit the Jews in Babylon and Media to enjoy their own laws also, he willingly promised to do hereafter as they desired. Then we're told that the Samaritans, seeing that Alexander had so greatly honored the Jews, determined to profess themselves Jews. For such is the disposition of the Samaritans, as we've already elsewhere declared, that when the Jews are in adversity, they deny that they're of kin to them. And then they confess the truth. But when they perceive that some good fortune has befallen them, they immediately pretend to have communion with them, saying that they belong to them and to derive their genealogy from the posterity of Joseph. So, that is the illusion that is made in the book of Revelation to those who say they are Jews and are not, but do lie and are of the synagogue of Satan. That is an illusion to the Samaritans. To what they've always done, as Josephus records, even back in ancient history, back at the time of Alexander, when the Jews... See, I read the portion here in Daniel that applies to Alexander the Great. Well, he was coming in and he was mad. And they said, we better show him something. We better do something to get on his good side. He's going to fight the Persians. We'll bring out and say, look, here are our sacred books, and you are mentioned in there. Let us read you, let us show you what it says. And so they read him, so he showed him there that the king of Greece was going to smash the king of Persia. And he was rather pleased with that and was sure that he must be the king of Greece that was there mentioned. I'm sure they stopped at the right part in the verse and didn't go on down to show him that he was going to be broken and his empire would divide. It's a matter, you have to know where to stop reading. You don't read the whole thing necessarily. They read him the good part, and he was so pleased with that he agreed to let them out of paying taxes every 7th year. Because if they were keeping the sabbatical year, you see, they wouldn't have anything to pay taxes with. The Samaritans thought this was a good idea. They didn't keep the sabbatical year, but they liked the idea of getting out of paying taxes, so they sent word down to Alexander that they were Jews too. And Josephus brings out, he says, whenever something goes well for the Jews, the Samaritans say, hey, we're all in this thing together. When something goes bad for the Jews, the Samaritans said, hey, we don't have anything to do with these people. We're no kin to them. We don't know them. So anyway, this is the story. This is the background. Josephus goes on through many of these events. All right. Now, Alexander is here met. Now, as we're coming down through the high priests, the one that is mentioned in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, let me show you so we kind of get the okay. In Nehemiah 12, verse 1, it says, "These are the priests and the Levites which went up with Zerubbabel." And it goes through and it names them. And then, this is in the days of Joshua. Now, in verse 10, we're given the genealogy of the priests that was maintained. Joshua begat Joachim. Joachim begat Eliashib. Eliashib begat Joiada. Joiada begat Jonathan, and Jonathan begat Jaddua. Now, Jaddua is the one that I read you in Josephus that met Alexander the Great. Jaddua was high priest from about 360 to about 330. That about 330 years before the birth of Christ. Now, now, as we come down within let's say, the generation following, Jaddua was succeeded by his son, who is known in history as the high priest Onias, and we read in Josephus that when Onias, the high priest, was dead, his son Simon became his successor. He is called Simon the Just because of his kind disposition toward God. And Simon the Just was high priest from about 309 to 280 BC. So this brings us down within about 280 years of the birth of Christ. The great synagogue founded by Ezra lasted until the time of Simon. Simon the Just was considered by the Jews as the last righteous high priest. In the aftermath of his death, there were events that took place. You see, by this time, we are getting quite a ways down from direct contact with the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. Simon was a young fellow, a young man at the time. Simon the Just was a young man at the time Alexander the Great came. The high priest at the time of Alexander the Great was one who had been born about the time of the death of Ezra and Nehemiah. And so you have a certain amount of continuity. You have a certain amount of continuity. But what's happened by this time is that Greek culture has spread, and the tendency of people is to try and be like the world, to try and blend in and be part of the society. So Greek language and Greek culture had begun to have great impact on the Jews. And the high priests had gotten involved in a lot of politics back and forth. They were they were ruled from Egypt by the Ptolemies. And then they got the idea of quitting paying taxes to the Ptolemies. Well, this didn't go over too well because there was warfare back and forth, and by 198 BC, Syria had moved in and had taken Judea from Egypt. The situation continued to degenerate because of the negative influences that had come in, and the fact that many of the priestly families, or much of the priestly family, was simply involved in politics and looking for worldly power. You got to a point where there was a literal fight between two brothers for the high priesthood, and they allied themselves with different factions. Jason became high priest in 175 BC. He was a Hellenist, and a Hellenist was one that accepted Greek culture. In other words, pagan culture. And he managed to usurp the priesthood from his brother. And they fought on it, and then a Benjamite purchased the priesthood from the Syrian ruler, which then Jason got it back. Well, when Jason had gotten it back, this is when, brings us down to 168 BC, which is when the Syrians, led by Antiochus Epiphanes, the Syrians had come down to fight against the Egyptians. They were going to conquer Egypt. They were always fighting back and forth. Well, he got down there to conquer Egypt, and the Roman fleet met him. And the Romans told him to turn around and get back where he came from because they weren't going to let him invade Egypt. Well, he did, but he was mad, and he wanted to take it out on somebody, so he decided the simplest thing to do was to go back through Jerusalem and see if he could kill a few Jews, which he did. He came through, and he was mad for several reasons. He was mad at the Jews in general because, you see, they stood in the way. The Greek concept reinforced from Babylon. Alexander the Great did something else. He spread the Greek language, but he also spread the Babylonian mystery religion. He took the schools of the priests in Babylon and he scattered them throughout his empire. His idea was to create one world, one language, one religion, one race, one people. That's why his soldiers were left behind, like in India there or near Afghanistan. The idea being, you see, that he wanted to create one world, but it was one world the devil's way. You know, he's in the succession of the Babylon system, the empires, the succession of empires, world-ruling empires that Daniel describes. So the devil has his plans for one world. God's going to create one world under Jesus Christ. But the devil has also tried to create one world. Going back to Nimrod and the Tower of Babel, coming all the way down. You see, the devil has in mind to create one world. The beast system, the beast power, in the future is going to have their attempt to create one world. But one world under the devil's sway and under the devil's influence. All right, Alexander spread the Greek language and culture, and he spread the Babylonian religion. These Babylonian priests were scattered. Now, the Jews, those who were keeping the law of God, stood in the way. They didn't blend in. They didn't worship the same gods. They didn't follow the same customs. Everybody else went along with it. These guys were the fly in the ointment. They were the ones that weren't doing what everybody else was doing. They weren't with the program. Antiochus Epiphanes didn't like that. And so he decided that he was going to come to Jerusalem and he was going to teach the Jews a lesson. He was going to take their temple, destroy the Scriptures. He was going to set up an idol of Jupiter Olympus there in the holy place. He was going to sacrifice a pig on the altar. He was going to put his man in as high priest, and he was going to make them follow the same religion that everybody else followed. He was going to have one world. Now, when you go through the succession here in Daniel 11, and it talks about the king of the north and the king of the south, and it goes back and forth, the king of the north and the king of the south. And we'll pick it up in verse 29. Well, let's go back a little earlier. Let's pick it up in Daniel 11, verse 21. In his estate, the estate of Heliodorus, the tax collector, who's mentioned in verse 20, shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. Seleucus, the previous king, didn't leave an heir, so his brother, who came in and drove out Heliodorus and obtained the kingdom. He flattered his way in. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. And with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. That would refer to the Jewish high priest. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully. And it goes on in verse 24, he shall enter peaceably even into the fattest places of the province, Galilee and Lower Egypt. And he's going to do various things. And in verse 28, he shall return to his land with great riches. His heart shall be against the holy covenant. He shall do exploits, return to his own land. And at the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south. But it shall not be as the former or as the latter. For the ships of Kittim, this is the Roman fleet. Kittim was the old name for southern Italy, and it is Sicily is the modern term. Kittim was the ancient term for that. The ships of Kittim, the Roman fleet, shall come against him, and he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. See, in other words, the Roman fleet came, kicked him out of Egypt, and so he was mad, and he went back, and what was he going to do? Take it out on the Jews. So he's going to return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. So he comes back, and he enters into a league with apostate Jews, with Jews who turn their back on the religion of the Jews. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice. He's going to stop. He did stop the daily sacrifice and place the abomination that made desolate. And what he did was he set up an abomination that led to desolation or destruction. The abomination was the statue of Jupiter Olympus and the offer of a pig on the altar. This was an abomination. It desecrated the temple, and it led to the desolation of Jerusalem. And such as do wickedly against the covenant, the Jews that forsook the truth, shall be corrupt by flatteries. They were going to get in good with him, you see. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Now, what you see as you go on down through, Jesus spoke in the New Testament, in Matthew 24 and in Luke 21, He spoke of an abomination of desolation that's going to take place in the future. He said, when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. See, Daniel the prophet spoke of an abomination of desolation. It was one that had taken place in 168 BC, 168 years before Christ. But Jesus said there would come again an abomination that would make desolate, that would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem right prior to His return. So there is an event that is to happen in the future of which this event that happened in the past was a type. So Antiochus Epiphanes, this vile person that obtained the kingdom by flatteries, the one who came in and who stopped the daily sacrifice and who set up the abomination that made desolate, he is a type of the final beast of Revelation 17 and of other places, you see. So, what happened is history, but it's also prophecy. When you understand about Antiochus and about some of the things that he did, you're also getting a picture of the future. Because just as his idea was, look, we need one world, one society, one language, one religion. Everybody will be happy if we all get together. Isn't that what is going to be said in the future by the beast and the false prophet? And who are they going to be mad at? Who are they going to want to persecute? Those that don't want to fall in line, those that don't want to get with the program. That's why they're going to attack physical Israel, and they're going to attack the church, the true church. They're going to persecute God's people because they're not wanting to join with the program. This is what's shaping up. You see, there is going to come together in Europe a final 10th revival. You know, that final 10th horn. Actually, the 7th revival, full revival of the empire. The 7th head of Revelation 10, or Revelation 17. It is going to come together. That final revival of the old Roman Empire. Babylon the Great, it's going to come together. And again, it's going to be the attempt to enforce one world, one religion. And who are they going to persecute? Those that don't go along with the program, those that don't blend in, that don't fit. This is exactly what Antiochus tried to do. He came in there to Jerusalem, and he was doing these things. Now I want to read to you a little bit from a historical account of it, a first-hand historical account, the book of Maccabees. This is not a part of Scripture. It was never intended to be. It was rather a historical book that the Jews preserved. They have never considered it Scripture, have simply considered it a part of a historical account, similar to Josephus. Now, it provides a first-hand account. Okay. It says, there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus surnamed Epiphanes, a son of Antiochus the king. In those days there went out of Israel wicked men, who persuaded many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the nations that are round about us. For since we departed from them, we've had much sorrow. So they built a place of exercise at Jerusalem, according to the custom of the heathens, a Greek gymnasium. They made themselves uncircumcised. They went to the point that they tried by an operation to actually disguise the fact that they had been circumcised, the sign of the covenant God made with Abraham. They didn't want to be identified as the people of God. They forsook the holy covenant and joined themselves to the heathen and were sold to do mischief. Now, after that Antiochus had smitten Egypt, he returned again, and he went up against Jerusalem with a great multitude. He entered proudly into the sanctuary, took away the golden altar and the candlestick of light and all the vessels, and he made a great massacre and spoke very proudly. It talks about they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary and defiled it. The inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them. The city was made a habitation of strangers. The sanctuary was laid waste like a wilderness. Antiochus wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, that everyone should leave his laws. So all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yes, many also of the Israelites consented to his religion and sacrificed unto idols and profaned the Sabbath. So what did you have? You had a falling away. And the king sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of the Jews that they should follow the strange laws of the land. And he forbade burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings, and said they should profane the Sabbaths and the holy days, and do all of these things. And whosoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said, should die. Many of the people gathered unto them, every one that forsook the law, and they committed the evils in this land. And in the 15th day of the month Keslev, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar. They built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. Whosoever was found with any book of the Testament, or if any consented to the law, the king's commandment was that they should be put to death. Now this is a type of the Great Tribulation. See, what Antiochus did historically was a type. Daniel prophesied of it in Daniel 11. And how that he would do wickedly against the covenant. And that he would pollute the sanctuary of strength and do all of these things. So, howbeit many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat any unclean thing. Wherefore they chose rather to die, that they might not be defiled with meats, and that they should not profane the holy covenant. So then they died. Now in those days there arose Matthias, the priest, the Matthias, the son of John, the son of Simeon, a priest. He left Jerusalem and dwelt in Modin. He had 5 sons, the last of which was Judas, called Maccabeus. Now, this decree went out, and Matthias said, though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him and fall away every one from the religion of their fathers and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not hearken to the king's words to go from our religion either to the right hand or to the left. Now, When he had left speaking these words, there came one of the Jews. Now what had happened was, they sent in the king's officers to each city to make the people come forward and bow down to an idol, kiss the toe of the idol. And the idea was they were going to make everybody agree. They came into this little village of Modin where Matthias the priest was. He was a priest. He was an elderly man. They called him up first, and they said, all right, you go first. And then everybody else comes in behind you. Well, when they told him he goes first, what he said was, what I just read. Everybody else can do it if they want to, but I'm not going to depart from the law of God. And when he had left speaking, verse 23, there came one of the Jews in the sight of all to sacrifice on the altar, according to the king's commandment. Always somebody who one of these chicken hearts that was going to come up and try to get in good with him. Now, when Matthias saw this, he was inflamed with zeal. His reins trembled, neither could he forbear to show his anger according to judgment. Wherefore he ran and slew him upon the altar, which, needless to say, created a little bit of a furor. And the king's commissioner, who compelled men to sacrifice, he killed at that time. And the altar he pulled down. Thus dealt he zealously for the law of God, like as did Phinehas unto Zamri. And Matthias cried throughout the city with a loud voice, whosoever is zealous of the law and maintains the covenant, let him follow me. So he and his sons fled to the mountains and left all that they ever had in the city. And so they went out, and Matthias died, and his son Judas, called Maccabeus, rose up in his stead. And Judas went forth and finally recaptured the city. Judas Maccabeus recaptured Jerusalem from the Syrians, and he won independence. And he cleaned the temple out and rededicated the temple to the worship of God, established himself as high priest. Now, actually celebrated his or established his brother as high priest, actually the first of the Maccabees that ruled. This became known as the Maccabee family. Now the Jews to this day celebrate this event. It's called Hanukkah. You heard about it. It generally takes place in December, which is the 10th month of the Jewish calendar, the month Kislev. This is the time when the temple was rededicated. It means it's called the Feast of Lights or the Feast of Dedication. You read of it in the book of John, chapter 10, that Jesus was in Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication. The Hebrew name is Hanukkah, which is the term we hear. A lot of Jews in this country kind of observe it as a pseudo-Christmas, but it has no connection with Christmas at all. It goes back to the time that the Maccabees cleansed the temple and rededicated it. It was the Feast of Dedication. This is what was spoken of in Daniel 11, you see, when he says, Daniel 11:31, that they would pollute the sanctuary and take away the daily sacrifice, place the abomination that makes desolate, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. Well, the people that did know their God were strong and did exploits. That was the Maccabees, and they cleansed the temple. Now, the Jews fought on, and finally by 141 BC, final Jewish independence was achieved from Syria. Simon Maccabee was high priest. He was succeeded by John Hyrcanus, who was of the Maccabee family, his son, who was high priest from 134 to 104. He is considered by the Jews to be the last righteous high priest. Now, there are events that occurred in the time of John Hyrcanus. It is basically at this time that the Sadducees and the Pharisees arose as sects that came to power. When the Pharisees were basically laymen. They were not of the priestly families. They saw the situation that had existed and the extent to which the priests had been corrupt. You see, the Maccabees kicked out the corrupt priesthood and installed themselves. They were of the priestly line, but not of it was not a direct father-son succession. They were of the priestly families, but they had to expel the corrupt high priest and establish themselves. Now, the situation the situation that arose was this group of people developed who had the idea that they wanted to enforce to make sure that things did not get back like it was. They felt like the priests needed somebody to keep an eye on them. And so this group of Pharisees began to arise. Now, it talks about the Pharisees and this came to their theory was to put a hedge about the law. They began to enact all kinds of traditions to enforce a strict separation. They were kind of a reform party that came in, and Josephus tells a little bit about them, and the priests were basically identified with the Sadducees. The Sadducees took the Scriptures and said, look, we accept the authority of Scripture, but we don't accept the authority of oral tradition. The Pharisees, the Sadducees were never a large, popular party. They were more restricted to the priesthood. Now, the son of John Hyrcanus, the priest, when John Hyrcanus died, his son Judas became high priest and proclaimed himself also as king. So now he united, he was both the civil ruler and both the civil ruler and the religious ruler of the land. Well, this continued on down a little bit. Now, we're told that when Hyrcanus was dead, the eldest son Aristobulus, intending to change the government into a kingdom, for he was resolved to do so, first of all put the diadem on his head. He made himself the king. Then the Pharisees, okay, let me read you a little bit here from Josephus about John Hyrcanus, or about the Pharisees here. Okay, John Hyrcanus had been, at an earlier time, as the Pharisees had first arisen, they had been allied with him, but he left the party of the Pharisees and abolished the decrees that they had imposed on the people. And The Pharisees have delivered to the people a great many observances by succession from their fathers, which are not written in the law of Moses, and for that is the reason that the Sadducees reject them. So, Hyrcanus was esteemed by God worthy of three privileges: the government of his nation, the dignity of the high priesthood, and prophecy, for God was with him. He is considered to be the last of the righteous high priests. Aristobulus made himself king, and then his son Alexander took over and ruled as king in his stead, and died in 76 B.C. Now, when Alexander died in 76 B.C., his widow, Queen Salome, was left. Now, I want to read you a statement from Josephus. So, Salome, the wife of Alexander, when she had taken the fortress, acted as her husband had suggested to her, and spoke to the Pharisees, and put all things into their power. Now, in the New Testament we read, Jesus made the statement, he said, the scribes and Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. Have you ever wondered how the scribes and Pharisees came to sit in Moses' seat? This is how. In 76 B.C., the religious authority over the nation was delivered to the Pharisees. Queen Salome. It really makes a transition. If you want a parallel in terms of eras of the church, what you have with the Maccabees make a parallel to the Philadelphia church. The people, the context and the description of what the Maccabees did, and really, as you would go through the eras of the Old Testament church, they represent the sixth period or era. They were succeeded by that final seventh one, which was the domination of the Pharisees that lasted from 76 B.C. until the destruction, or until the time of the New Testament church. It was the Pharisees who were in Moses' seat at the time when Christ came on the scene. They had gotten in Moses' seat, having been placed there, you see, as the Maccabee family, after several generations, had basically gotten away from that zeal, and finally the widow of this Maccabee king put herself to perpetuate herself in power. She gave the Pharisees religious control over the nation. Well, within a short period of time, this was in 76 B.C., and by 63 B.C., the Romans came in and established their rule, and less than 30 years later, Herod was set up as king by the Romans. And he, of course, was king when Jesus Christ was born. The story that we have is a story of ups and downs. It is a story of the spread of Greek influence and Greek religion, or Babylonian religion with a Greek overlay of Greek culture, a Greek language that spread throughout the known world at that time. A constant bickering back and forth with the Jews in the middle between the Greek kingdom of Syria to the north and the Greek kingdom of Egypt to the south. And this bickering went back and forth. It culminated finally as more and more of the Jews had gotten away from God and entered into an alliance with Antiochus Epiphanes, who came in and launched what was really a type of the Great Tribulation. The result of that was, of course, the Maccabees and the cleansing of the temple, a certain revival that took place that lasted for a period of time, lasted really for basically a generation or a long generation, and began to trickle out until finally, by 76 B.C., the kingdom was basically turned over to the Pharisees to govern the religious affairs of the nation. And it set the stage for the world into which Jesus Christ came. The Romans came in and picked up the pieces and governed things from a civil standpoint. The Pharisees governed it religiously. They came in with their own ideas and their own traditions that they were going to solve the problem using human reasoning. So, what we have is the people continually, the temptation all the way through. You've got these ups and downs, these revivals and these departures. The tendency has always been for people to begin to compromise with the world, to try to be like the world, to try to blend in, as Satan tries to get his influence in, to water down the law of God, to get people to kind of back off of real zealous obedience to the law. And time after time, God has raised someone up to make sure that the truth was preserved. Well, the time, of course, came when it was in this context that Jesus, the Messiah, was born. Coming with the good news of the kingdom of God. Not an earthly kingdom that was going to be set up as one of the competing governments of this world, but a government that God is going to establish. And I hope that in going through some of this material, we've gained a little bit of insight into the story flow of the Old Testament and even the time between the Testaments, which, while it is time between the Testaments, it is also covered in the Bible because Daniel covers it through prophecy in Daniel 8 and in Daniel 11. And we see these ups and downs and that culminated in the time of Jesus Christ. We're going to pick it up next Bible study. We will start into a new series. Having completed this Old Testament survey series, we'll start into a new series on the New Testament. So with that, we'll be concluded this evening.